Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for July 9th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today with John Hogaboom, Jim Clausing, and Tony Tortorisi, and I'm Brian Rexroad. And John, let's talk a little first about some Java remote access tools. I guess you found some information on that?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So we talk a lot about targeted attacks on the program, usually originating from spear-phished emails to specific targets, very focused types of spear-phished emails. And usually those have some kind of maybe a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet as a malicious, weaponized type of payload. Sometimes they'll just do an executable or a zip file inside the email as well, or a link inside the email. Well, recently we've been seeing a trend, people using a publicly available Java-based rat. And so what we've been detecting, and actually Symantec has a write-up here as well about it, is there's been a specific campaign going on targeting government agencies, and the context of the spear-phished email has two PDF documents in it, but usually those are benign. And there's also an additional one that ends in .jar, which means it's a Java archive, basically, and it's an app inside a jar file. So if you have the Java virtual machine or the Java software installed on your PC, double-clicking on that jar will actually run it. And when it actually runs in the context of, it's not sandboxed or anything at that point like it would be inside your browser when you have a Java applet. It's running as, a regular program. So it has access to your file system, etc. In any event, so the context of this is there's a publicly available tool out there. It's called JRAT, and it's freely available. Symantec detects it as backdoor.jeetrat. And the other interesting thing about it is it's cross-platform. It can work on basically any platform that supports Java for the most part. So Windows, Linux, and Mac are all possible targets for this. I did mention the particular, relative to this article that they're talking about here, there's a command and control that was used in that particular attack, and we've seen this used in a couple of other attacks as well. The same command and control domain here is also been used in some RTF exploit ones. So I mentioned sometimes they use Word documents or Excel spreadsheets. There's also an exploit vector through the rich text format, which is another kind of document type format that you can have on a Windows platform and leverage that to drop a payload as well. So probably same actor set because they're using the same domain name, use the same C2, and now they're using that same C2 for this Java-based rat. So something to be aware of. If you do get emails inside your enterprise or your company with jar attachments, a lot of people probably filter these because they are aware that they're executable content, but maybe some don't. So it's something to be aware of that this tactic is being used more and more lately.
Makes sense there, John. And so you mentioned multiple platforms. Do you think, it's been some time since we talked about some of these multi-platform attacks. Would this potentially apply to mobile platforms as well?
Potentially. I don't think we've actually seen, or I'm not aware of it, this particular one being used on a mobile platform. But I suppose it's possible. If you have I know that a lot of these, Android and whatnot have support for Java. So it's potentially possible, although I don't know that anybody's actually tried that to date.
Right. And most of these, I guess the examples that you were showing here, the jar was actually a payload in an email, but I presume it could also be simply a URL out on a website as well, right?
Yes, but in that sense, it will probably, I guess it depends. It depends on how your browser retrieves that, whether or not it's going to save it as a file and then open it, or if it's going to open it inside your browser in a sandbox context. I'm not quite sure what you would get if you clicked on a link that had that.
Okay, good point there. But I guess what I was sort of driving at is that, making sure, usually you wouldn't expect that you'd have emails a medium for sending applications, so it does make sense to be including that as a part of your filtering strategy. And I don't know if Tony has any thoughts on that as well, but there might be potential for paying attention to what proxies or web proxies are doing to see if it makes sense to use some filtering in those cases as well.
Yeah, just to step in with that, when it comes down to email security and your company's perimeter, one of the things that I always recommend is blocking any sort of executable like jar files, executables, batch files, anything that once it gets into the mailbox, as soon as they click on it, can actually start up, depending on the privileges that the user has. But yeah, definitely try to block those as much as you can. If you're working with business partners that have to send those sorts of files, work with those business partners to find different ways of getting those into your network, and then that prevents the external third-party people that want to infect your network by just blocking it at the email perimeter.
Right. And if there's a significant distribution, it can certainly save on network bandwidth as well.
Absolutely.
All right, very good. Thanks, John. Thanks, Tony. And let's go over to Jim here and talk a little bit about some of the recent Microsoft patches.
Yeah, today is Patch Tuesday, Microsoft for July. So there are 7 patches today. 6 of them are critical. So obviously, as soon as you can get them applied, apply them. But the one I really wanted to talk about today is the one that was only marked important. And that one was, well, I guess among the criticals, I did want to mention that 2 of them seem to be issues with parsing true-type fonts, and one of them was an issue that I think we briefly mentioned when we heard about the vulnerability a couple weeks ago, one in win32k.sys, the driver. But the one that I really wanted to talk about is the one that they marked important, and that was the one in Windows Defender. And this one is a privilege escalation, which is why Microsoft only calls it important, although I sometimes argue with their classifications, because I think this one could potentially be at least as critical as any of the other ones. But the issue with this one, it was an unquoted path variable. And my friend Mark Baguette at the Internet Storm Center actually did a Storm Center diary on this back in, I believe it was November, where he had discovered and had started trying to find applications that installed services that didn't quote their path variables properly. The issue is, you've got paths in Microsoft, C:\program files. Well, there's a space in there, but a lot of programs, when they're parsing things, they'll hit the space and think that's the end of the string. And so what he discovered was there are a number of services that get installed by various applications that don't properly quote their path variables. And what can happen here is that when the service starts up, you'll get some sort of an error message that it was that they couldn't find the program. And the one way to find out if you've got these is you put something innocuous in, put the calculator or something, copy it over into the root directory, C:\\, call it program.exe or documents.exe, and you'll find out if there are unquoted C:\program files or C:\documents and settings. It's an interesting problem that a lot of people don't really understand and don't look at too carefully. The guy who actually reported this vulnerability that got fixed today by Microsoft discovered it after he read Mark's article in November and had reported it to Microsoft in March, and they fixed it today. So I just thought that was something that probably more of our viewers and listeners should be aware of the issue, and that's why I wanted to mention it today. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That's actually, it is interesting and sort of points out how the just subtle things can turn into sort of a security challenge here. I suspect this is rated as important partly because it's an elevation issue as opposed to you already have to have access to the machine at least as a normal user to be able to use that. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, that's Microsoft always calls privilege escalation important rather than critical, and for that reason that you have to have gotten something malicious on the box beforehand, but that could have been somebody clicked something and dropped a payload on there. I worry about these things, but that's absolutely the reason that they rate it as important rather than critical is because you have to have gotten the malicious payload on the box ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so if you got compromised by the Java rat that we just talked about, and then use that to escalate your privileges, and then you would have administrative level access, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's just two subtle little vulnerabilities that could turn into a big compromise. Good point. I guess the other thing I have to mention here, Jim, is that I remember years and years ago when sort of the first buffer overflow exploit was associated with font parsing, and it kind of amazes me that still today we haven't quite got the font parsing problem solved. But
exactly, among the things that were patched today were a couple instances of this true type font parsing, GDI library, which was, it's probably been 8 or 9 years ago since that was the big 0 day over Christmas and New Year's GDI library stuff. So this stuff it's so big and complex that people keep finding the same issues in new places all the time.
All right. Well, thank you. A couple of good points there. Next story here, I'll go ahead and I'd like to share with you a article that I ran across, and this is actually on a site called netsecurity.org. I'm not particularly familiar with this site. I'll leave it to you to go and take a look and evaluate for yourself. But the article here in this particular example is one that entitled "Large Pony Botnet Controller Discovered." This is actually somebody discovered I think what they're referring to is a pony as being basically a place to gather data so that the attacker, from a botnet that is lots of compromised computers reporting back to this point, and then the attacker can go and retrieve the data that it's collected over time. And this one apparently is a password stealer of some sort. So I don't know a lot of details about the actual botnet, but what was actually interesting is they posted some information about the statistics of information that had been basically stored on this pony. And in fact, I think the interface that they were using or the graphics they posted were actually reporting tools that the botnet controller provided. And what I found to be interesting here is they list a number of different browsers for which a number of passwords had been stolen, presumably from the browser's caching or from the browser storing. And Firefox was at the top of the list. Google Chrome next at the top, next in line here is sort of a close second. And then Internet Explorer third, with literally almost a third, a little bit over a third of what Firefox had in terms of the number of passwords stolen. I don't know if that had something to do with the popularity of the browsers, or if it had something to do with, the convenience of storing passwords on the browsers or something like that. I don't know. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
One thing that comes to mind is maybe there's a shift in popularity for more Firefox, Chrome versus IE being used on the desktop, and maybe it just happens to be capturing what people are using the most. I mean, there are shifts back and forth.
There certainly have been shifts. That's true. And there are a number of others listed. So I'll let you go ahead and take a look at the article. And it's fairly brief, just shows a few things that I found to be of interest. I guess one other point is they also had some websites in terms of popularity of where passwords have been stolen from. Turns out that Facebook's at the top of the list there. I don't know that that's a significant issue in the sense that, perhaps they could use that information to gather information about you. Obviously Facebook is a place where you're sharing information, but I think would be of a greater concern is making sure that you're not using the same password for Facebook or, your Google accounts, for example, as you are using for other perhaps more critical things like online banking. So just something to keep in mind here. A nice little reminder. So with that, let's pass the reins over to Tony here, and I guess, Tony, you wanted to talk a little bit about email security?
Yeah, I wanted to change gears a bit and speak a little bit on email security. I wanted to pose some questions to the panel and see what everyone thinks about it. But in particular, what I wanted to focus on today is email encryption. There's many points of exposure when you're dealing with email, and email is one of the major ways to communicate from business to business, from worker to worker. So I wanted to kind of dive into this a bit and get your guys' perspectives on it. I mean, basically with email, there's a lot of different things that get transferred. I mean, the data alone could be just plain old work data, or it could be personal, financial, medical, confidential company data. Really, whatever the businesses deal with, there's a lot of that should be kept secret. So with that, there's a few different options with email encryption, one being TLS, Transport Layer Security. This particular thing, they're basically tunnels, encrypted tunnels to move the data around, the emails around. Typically, they're used out on the internet. So if you're working with one business partner and you have TLS set up, the emails that are being sent back and forth are encrypted, and third parties can't view what sort of information you're transferring back and forth. There's many different uses for that, and basically business to business is a great example. But also there's times where the employee or the company has to encrypt it from user to user or viewer to viewer, and that's where endpoint encryption would come into play, where right before you hit send on the email, you actually encrypt it, and it travels through your company's network to the other person. It even goes out in the internet, and it's still encrypted, even if you're not using TLS. So there's different ways of securing your company's data. And the question that I wanted to throw out is, do we as IT and security professionals, do we use it enough in our businesses? Also, how do we get the word out to our companies and business partners that we work with on, pushing out email encryption and making sure that everyone knows when to use it, how to use it, and the certain situations to make sure that your company's data is safe and secure?
Well, I'll start, Tony. And I'm going to really put a twist on this here. I guess the first thing that I would say is that we use email too much. The issues that I see with email in general, regardless of whether you do encryption or not, is that it's basically distributing data all over the place in an unaccountable way. And, S-MIME provides some protections in the sense that presumably only the intended recipients can actually get to the email in the first place because it's only encrypted for them. But my personal preference is to go more toward collaboration portals, have actually a web place that you're storing things where you have some stronger accountability about who accesses things, when they access those things, and it actually makes it more accessible without distributing or spraying it all over the internet. So forgive me for sort of twisting your subject there, but I think the first order of business is to get away from email. I think email is a good method for notification, but is actually sharing information, documents and collaborating on things is actually a fairly poor choice.
No, I think that's a good twist because you're right. There's a lot of misuse when it comes down to email. So with that said, there's definitely different methods to move your confidential data around. And you're right. People randomly just grab a bunch of information, throw it on an email, send it out to a distribution list. People reply to all, and it gets spread out all over the place. So I like your opinion on it. I like your twist.
Yeah. So with that said, I think the whole notion of TLS, I've really kind of struggled with exactly what that's intending to do. I think it provides perhaps a little bit of a comfort factor. I think you had suggested in a B2B transaction it can help to provide some better protection from compromise over the communication channel, and certainly there's value in that. But personally, I mentioned earlier, I tend to be more partial to SMIME. I think it's a fairly well thought out tool. The struggle has always been managing the certificates associated with that. If you go to a commercial service that provides sort of the ability to provide a relationship between individuals or facilitate those communications, provides a PKI for the public key infrastructure, it tends to be rather expensive. But then if you do, you can set up your own certificate authority. And the constraint there is that you have difficulties with communicating with other organizations that aren't using the same certificate authority. So, and I guess along those lines, there's always sort of been a little bit of a user understanding issue. And aside from that, as soon as you put the encryption options in the end user's hands, they have to remember to use it in the appropriate times. And the tendency is to default to sending things in an unsecure way, and they have to remember, when they need to encrypt something, and oftentimes that gets forgotten. I've been guilty of that problem in the past myself. So,
my take on it is, TLS is nice in that it encrypts it on the wire, so in transit, you're not going to see it, but both endpoints have to agree to use TLS, or you default back to, SMTP in the clear. I mean, I set up TLS on my mail server at home, and I get maybe a quarter of my email comes in over TLS encrypted connections. The email itself is unencrypted, so it's, on the servers on either end, it's still unencrypted. So I like TLS. I turn it on, but it doesn't actually get used all that often in my home setup. And as Brian, as you pointed out, the issue with SMIME or GPG, PGP is with the key distribution or the certificates and managing the PKI, the public key infrastructure. That's been an issue that we've been trying to deal with since we started talking about public key 20 years ago or more.
Right. It's still effectively a professional driver-only type tool. You really have to want to do it.
I'll throw one other thing out there in that, so if Jim was somebody who could actually snoop all of the email that Brian and I are sending back and forth to each other, if I send 9 emails to Brian unencrypted, and then the 10th one I send encrypted, Jim at that point would have a pretty good idea that whatever is in that one email is probably important. So from a PGP, SMIME kind of usage where you're kind of encrypting at the client side, if you're going to talk to somebody, you should do it always encrypted. So all those communications, all 10 of those emails I should have sent to Brian in an encrypted way, and that way it makes it much more difficult for an adversary like Jim, who might be intercepting them, to know which one was actually the important one.
Right.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of misdirection when you're trying to hide what you're talking about, because it might not be appropriate for other eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's one. I think this is a well-known issue with S/MIME as well, and it's true with that is the message encryption. Generally speaking, clearly the distribution is in the clear, and the subject is in the clear. And all too often, I'll get an encrypted email that basically states the secret part as a part of the subject, and kind of defeats the encryption to a large extent. For somebody, you'd mentioned, John, if you send 9 of them unencrypted into one encrypted, once you develop that relationship in terms of what types of things that people are talking about, if they have access to those emails in general, and then that one particular one is encrypted, it's going to be very difficult to really provide a decent protection around that information. That is, a lot of the context around it has probably been revealed already. So it is a tricky problem to solve, and that's, again, why I kind of put my twist in there in the beginning. That is, if you keep things on a website where you have more controls in terms of accessibility and accountability, that is, track record of who's visited, and then it becomes more of a pull thing. That is, the people that need the information actually go to get it, as opposed to putting it on a lot of end user machines and distribution servers along the way.
Right.
Good discussion, Tony. I thank you for bringing that up. Next thing here is I wanted to just at least share with you very briefly an article that was in the USA Today recently, and the note that it was making is related to new, basically cybersecurity training on the rise for young students. That is, it's talking a little bit about some of the programs that are coming about to provide cybersecurity training. That is, among the folks that are here and certainly listening, you're most likely interested in this sort of thing, and there are some programs developing. Now, I don't know of any specific direct connection. I didn't see it in the article mentioned anywhere, but this is probably somewhat of a growth from the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative. Some of you may be aware of this, that was basically an initiative that started under the Bush administration and is carried through with the Obama administration. There's the full documentation's on the whitehouse.gov website. And initiative number 8 was, in fact, to expand cyber education. That is, to develop more of a workforce that's educated in cybersecurity and to be able to do their part to protect not just national infrastructure, but protect commercial interests as well. So it's good news that some of these programs are coming together at universities, internships at companies, and the like, and we hope that develops significantly further. It's certainly from an employment standpoint, some good opportunities for those that are concerned about their employment opportunities when they finish college. So with that, let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. The first item that I'd like to share with you is it's actually both scan sources, an increase in scan sources, as well as probes on port 1998 TCP. I had to look this one up, and it's actually associated with Cisco X25. I can't imagine who is using X25 protocol anymore. A lot of the folks listening here probably aren't even familiar with that, but that's a precursor of basically packet exchanges precursor to the internet, where actually each link was kind of like a TCP connection in itself. But with that said, it looks like there's some scanning activity or an interest in scanning activity here, and it both showed up in terms of the number of sources that were doing that scanning. Not a huge number. We peaked out as just a little over 100 sources that were doing this scanning activity. And we've seen somewhat spurious and also some continuous, somewhat activity scanning that coincides or correlates from a time point of view with that increase in the number of sources. That activity is continuing forward. It started around right around the beginning of July for the most part. There were some inklings of that starting way back in, I guess around the end of June, June 27th or so. All of these sources, nearly all of them at least, are, in terms of the number of sources as well as the number of probes, are from multiple networks in China. That is, most of those sources seem to be located there. There may be some other motivation that may not be looking for X25, by the way, but then again, there's a possibility they're looking for maybe some legacy control systems or something that might be using some legacy, packet capabilities that are being basically tunneled over the internet.
Brian, real quick, when you talk about control systems, what exactly are you referring to?
Well, I was intentionally vague about that, but, control systems that might be associated with, industrial control systems, for example. So that's purely speculative on my part. I don't really know of any specific systems that might be targeted here, but certainly, hopefully, that anybody that's using those types of things will recognize this and take a closer look. Next item is one that we reported last week, and actually, when we reported it last week, it was somewhat on the tail end of the activity. This is scan probes on port 1080 TCP. We talked about it, as I said. It's associated with SOCs, basically a gateway capability. There are several source IPs doing this scanning activity. The majority of addresses and the overwhelming majority of the activity is from China. When we reported on this last week, on July 2nd, we were seeing basically some spiky activity. That continued. There was actually sort of a brief break in activity at the end of July 3rd, and then it resumed again through the 4th and into the 5th, and has since seemed to have died off. So not exactly clear what the motivation here is, but it's most likely looking for some means to anonymize their activity. Next one, also one that we reported last week and continues through today, is scan probes on port 2433 TCP. As I described last time, this port is associated with the CODA server. It's a network file system, but it's not clear that that's actually what they're targeting. This particular IP address, and there's only really one IP address that's doing this scanning activity. This particular address has apparently been consistently also scanning port 1433 TCP, which is associated with Microsoft SQL database. So there perhaps have been some reason to believe, or some discovery of some SQL databases that are using port 2433 as an alternative port, and they're looking for that. Again, that's speculative on my part. It's not really clear why they'd be doing both of those. So it could be looking for these network file systems, the CODA server service, or also perhaps looking for Microsoft SQL. Next item here is, I've often been reporting on DNS amplification or DNS reflection attacks. I just sort of wanted to point out a case on July 3rd where we had sort of a surge in activity. So what this particular graph is showing here is actually a difference, that is the surges in activity we're seeing over time relative to the baseline. And sort of the subtlety here that isn't shown on the graph is that there is, in fact, a baseline of attack activity using DNS reflection attacks. That kind of gets averaged out in the end, or normalized. But we did see a surge in activity, and this equated upwards around, I think, yes, it is in bits per second. So this exceeded up around 4.5 gigabits per second in the attack activity, spanned for the course of about a day, and averaged perhaps on the order of about 3 or 4 gigabits per second throughout the day. And that's in excess of sort of the regular baseline of activity. The other thing I should point out here is I'm showing two other ports on this graph, not just port 53, but also showing port 0, which adds in the effect of fragmented packets, which is often the case in these types of attacks. And another case where fragmented packets tend to be apart is actually associated with SNMP reflection attacks. There was a little spike. It was back on, it looks like June 21st here, of an SNMP reflection attack, and a spike in the fragmentation of packets associated with that as well. But it seems like the SNMP reflection attacks are significantly either smaller or or more distributed than the DNS activity. So you want to keep in mind both of those as possibilities, that is, either abusing your systems that might be exposed to the Internet, or attacks that might be targeting your organization and using these mechanisms, because the mitigation or the response to those needs to be a little bit different than you might do otherwise. Looking at the most probed ports for the last week, no real surprises. Well, I guess there's one little bit of a surprise here. Typically, we see as the most active port to be port 445 TCP. In this particular week, day, port 8080 TCP was the most active. So there was a lot of probing activity on port 8080 TCP yesterday, and this was actually on July 8th. And I think an Internet Protect alert was issued on that particular topic. No other significant surprises. We see port 22 TCP, that's SSH. Port 1433, we talked about that. That's Microsoft SQL Database. Port 3389, that's, help me out, folks, here. I'm drawing a blank. It's Remote Desktop Protocol. There we go. And then 5900, which is virtual network computing, which both of those are remote access tools, and then port 23, which is Telnet. We also still see the peer-to-peer activity associated with zero-access botnet. That's port 16464 as well as 16471. And one that I tend to gloss over here, this Type 8 ICMP, that's basically a ping request. ICMP Type 8, and we generally don't recognize that or talk about that from a security probing point of view, but there certainly are attack tools that will first do a ping request to see if the host responds, and then if there is a response, start probing on other ports. So we shouldn't discount that, but the consequence here is that you don't get a lot of information about what type of application they might be probing against, just using this piece of information. Next item, the most sources probing. Again, port 445 is at the top of the list in this particular case. No other particular surprises. We do see port 80 TCP as being having the most sources doing probing here, and we see other ports associated with the zero access peer-to-peer activity. That's 16465, 16470, 16471, and 16464. All of those are UDP ports. And last but not least here, the daily reconnaissance index for the last several weeks have been showing, actually for months now, since about February, showing sort of a downward trend in activity. Over the last week or so here, we do see just a minor little uptick in activity. I don't know if that's a trend or if it's just a small spike in activity, but we'll want to keep an eye on that. That is, there were more probes on the network in the last week or so than we had typically seen in the last several weeks. And I guess with that, that's our show for today. Does anybody else have any thoughts you'd like to share? Okay, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also contact us through Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTrack. ThreatTrack video is also available not just from the AT&T Tech channel, which is att.com/ThreatTrack. It's also available on YouTube. And you can subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes. And thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Jim, John, and Tony. And we'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.